Our final paper of the day and our final paper for this symposium is going to be presented by Shannon Aaron. Shannon Aaron is the great-great-grandson of Dawson Dawson-Watson. He's the former editor of the monthly magazine MassBay Antiques. He's worked as auction coordinator for the Boston Gallery of Skinner Auctions and currently owns the antique business ModHaus Antiques of Boston with his wife Susan Jacobson. Shannon is also an accomplished Celtic musician on both the cittern and the tenor banjo and has appeared on stage with the Chieftains and Marianne Faithfull. Please welcome Shannon Aaron.
So before I begin this morning, I'd like to dedicate this presentation to my mother, Sherry Dawson Hamilton, who has been gently but persistently urging me to put together something for Cassetta for a number of years now. So she shares much of the credit for bringing us together this morning. So, my mother, this is your belated Mother's Day present. So thank you all for joining me here today. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you here in my hometown of San Antonio, and only a mile or two from where I was born and grew up. You know, I've been told it's customary to preface any talk with a joke or some witticism related to the topic, but I assumed everyone would know my favorite art joke, which is, why did Van Gogh become a painter? No one? Because he didn't have an ear for music. I know. So, I thought this little newspaper clipping I found among my family's scrapbooks might be a bit more appropriate to our gathering this morning. I imagine it must have been from some social or gossip column in the 1930s. And I hope you find the reference to the Texas artist Eloise Polk McGill as amusing as I did. I'm guessing she needed someone to come with a ladder. In the late 1970s, we had moved from Texas to upstate New York, but my grandmother still lived here in San Antonio. And during one winter vacation, she traveled north to visit us for the holidays. One of our favorite family activities was always a trip to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Manhattan. And we'd always have a special lunch alongside the dramatic fountains of the old Dorothy Draper cafeteria, which sadly doesn't exist anymore. Although the Met's King Tut exhibit was my all-time favorite, it was another of their blockbuster shows featuring the French artist Claude Monet, which affected my life in a much more personal way. And I will never forget the solemn hush of the crowd in those darkened galleries as we entered among the liquid blues and greens of his water lily paintings. And that afternoon, amidst those enormous canvases, my grandmother suddenly leaned close to me and whispered something that I can still hear clearly in my ear today, nearly a half-century later. I remember it was just as we had stepped in front of a painting of tall poplar trees, and I was imagining in that instant how they'd make excellent telephone poles or ship's masts, and she offhandedly remarked to me, "I think Granddaddy painted there." I was 14 or 15 at the time, and this was definitely news to me. Yet somehow all I could do in that moment was to just nod thoughtfully as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Of course, I knew by then that my great-grandfather and his father were both talented artists. The walls of the Texas home I grew up in the 1960s were full of paintings of all sizes, many in enormous hand-carved golden frames, and ball throwing was not allowed in that house. Somehow, though, Texas just seemed so impossibly distant from the French countryside on display before me that I couldn't even imagine how the two could possibly be connected. A few years later, as a college freshman, I came to visit my grandmother here in San Antonio during Christmas break, and I finally had the chance to question her about this Claude Monet situation. So in response, she arose and opened the lid to an old hall chest and rummaged around briefly before handing me a stack of yellowed typewritten pages. And she said, "It's all here. I haven't read it in years, but I suppose you might find it interesting." "What was he like?" I asked. "Oh, everyone thought he was just like Ronald Colman. He got that all the time," she said, adding, "and he spoke just like him, too." It wasn't until years later, with the arrival of YouTube, that I was finally able to hear what this 1930s English film star sounded like. So here's just a small clip to set the tone for us this morning.
"Why, you little fool, I'm giving you something you never had before, a soul on canvas. I'm making you immortal. 100 years from now, they'll be looking at you, when you're dust and water and a whisper of the wind."
Later that evening, as I read through the more than 100-page manuscript entitled Things Remembered by Dawson-Watson, I discovered the life story of my great-great-grandfather was so full and remarkable that even by my age then of 18, he had far surpassed any accomplishments I could ever even imagine being capable of. So today, I'd like to take you for a bit of a journey and to retrace the footsteps of my ancestor, who many of you may know as the early 20th century Texas painter, Dawson Dawson-Watson. So before we go any further, one question I'm often asked is, what's with the strange repetition in his name? Well, it's known linguistically as a reduplicative. It was part of a centuries-old tradition among certain gentry in England with hyphenated last names. To bestow a child with a first name taken from the father's surname, or as in this case Dawson, was to honor that side of the family. Or as my grandmother shrugged when I asked, it was just a Welsh thing. Many years before Dawson arrived here in this river city to claim the largest artistic prize in American history, he led a fascinating life with enough adventure and creative activities to fill several lifetimes, and I hope to give you some insight this morning into who he was before he followed his final destiny and came to call the Lone Star State his home. He was born in England in July of 1864 into a very artistic and well-educated family. His father, the Yorkshire-born John Dawson-Watson, was one of the leading magazine and literary illustrators of his day. He exhibited at the prestigious Royal Academy annually for nearly 40 years and was a member of the Royal Watercolor Society. And his familiar drawings and etchings were regular features in many of the popular English magazines of the day, such as Once a Week, Good Words, London Society, The Graphic, and countless others. And among the many classic books John illustrated were A Pilgrim's Progress, Arabian Nights, Robinson Crusoe, and Watts' Divine and Moral Songs. Works by him are in the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Tate, and the British National Museums of Norwich and Liverpool. To the young Dawson, his father's shoes must have seemed impossibly hard to fill. John had been a precocious talent from a young age, having made this drawing of a Newfoundland dog at the age of 7. And by the age of 8, he was already well into painting with oils. Throughout Dawson's childhood in the 1860s and 70s, the family moved frequently about England, from Surrey, south of Tynemouth, along the northern coast, where John made a series of important illustrations of shipwrecks for the Graphic magazine. Eventually, they settled in the very fashionable area of London's St. John's Wood, where the dinner table was always filled with many of the most influential pre-Raphaelite artists and intellectual figures of the Romantic age. Among them, Frederick Walker, Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema, Ford Madox Brown, George Innes, Alfred Lord Tennyson, James McNeill Whistler, James Ruskin, William Morris, Edward Burne-Jones, and even Winslow Homer. These are examples of some of John's late Romantic era works in oil from the mid-19th century. Not only artists and writers, but stage actors, particularly the finest Shakespearean talents of the day, were frequent house guests. And the dramatic arts were a constant obsession in the household, and would influence Dawson's love of the theater for the remainder of his life. The family's habit of constant relocation would become another major theme in Dawson's life. He wrote at the age of 15, he desperately wanted to go to America, where an older school friend had written him of his exploits as a cowboy, a bartender, and a butter salesman. His interest in the Southwest had been piqued at a young age by George Catlin, who exhibited his paintings of Native Americans in London and famously brought members of the Ojibwe Nation to visit the Queen during his childhood. In the 1870s, the United States had begun its great period of migration across the interior plains and towards the Southwest and Pacific coast. The American frontier West had become part of a new mythology to the rest of the civilized world. The very same English magazines and periodicals that John illustrated would have supplied the English public with serialized stories of gunfights, stagecoach robberies, and images of Native Americans in the romantic cowboy life. Certainly the notion of Texas as an exotic land would have been on the young Dawson's radar from a very young age. The 1881 England census listed Dawson-Watson as an art student, and during the next 2 years, he found commercial work painting tiles for the interior decorating department of Hal James and Company, a distinguished London firm of jewelers and silversmiths famously mentioned in a Gilbert and Sullivan opera. He submitted a painting which was accepted for exhibition at the Royal Academy at the age of 16. And when he was 17, he began studying with a friend of his father, the American painter Mark Fisher. Now, Fisher had been a pupil of George Inness and had studied in Paris in the 1860s alongside his fellow student, Alfred Sisley. And it's fair to say he was an early exponent of Impressionism. Here's a few examples of Fisher's works, and I think you can certainly see a certain loose suggestiveness in his brushwork. This was an epiphany to Dawson because it allowed him to experiment with a much more stylistic expression that was different and more modern than his father. And after 4 years of intense study with Fisher, he was offered financing to study in France by another friend of his father's, the brewer Henry Boddington. And there's a family debt there that I've tried to repay every time I visit England because it's literally my favorite beer on the planet. So, with a healthy stipend of £50 a month, he settled first on the rural coast of Brittany, where he stayed for several months before moving to Paris. This is one of his earliest known works that we're aware of, and we believe it was painted during his first few months after arrival in France. When he first visited the famed Académie Julian, he recalled that the studios were packed solid with students, about 100 to a room. And rather than becoming one among the masses, he decided to use some of his newfound funding to instead train privately with the academic painter Carolus Duran, who had just a few years earlier been the teacher of John Singer Sargent. He studied with Carolus through the winter of 1886, and by the next year he began studying with Raphael Collin, whose style was much more closely associated with the French Impressionists. And by 1888, Dawson-Watson had begun work on his first large-scale canvas of 5 by 8 feet, entitled Orchard, for entry in that year's prestigious Salon des Indépendants. It was common then, after sufficient years of training in the studio, for young artists to settle upon some scenic region to paint outdoors or en plein air, since painters of that century were expected to produce alluring landscapes and charming scenes of agrarian life. It was the American painter John Leslie Breck who first introduced Dawson-Watson to a small group of like-minded artists who had begun to gather in a small village 50 miles upriver on the Seine. It was Blair Bruce, Theodore Wendell, Henry Fitch Taylor, Willard Metcalf, and Theodore Robinson, several of whom would become known as the leading American Impressionists of their era, claimed to have just discovered this little town north of Paris. And Breck was dispatched back to the city to bring on more followers. And Dawson-Watson was his first recruit. although he would later claim to have innocently stumbled upon this tiny village after having spotted it across the river from the train, it was clear that this was a cover story to disguise themselves as fanboys of the master, Claude Monet. After the death of his wife Camille, Monet had arrived in Giverny several years earlier with his 2 sons and paramour Alice Hochet, along with her 4 young daughters. Dawson-Watson's first residence in the village was the Hotel Baudy, which became the center of their colony for the next 5 years. And not surprisingly, the young colonists always refer to it as the Baudy House. The owner, Monsieur Baudy, very agreeably built them all painting sheds and studios in his courtyard and along the hillside behind the hotel. It was here that Dawson-Watson painted some of his best-known scenes of French country life, notably gathering firewood and harvest time. Another large portrait depicts Monsieur Lucien Baudy himself in hunting attire with his rifle. But it's this remarkably spontaneous depiction of a turnip field in winter, which is among my favorites of his early French works. Dawson-Watson met his wife, Mary Hoytzeller, during his first year in Giverny, and she was on a grand tour as the traveling companion of the noted Texas artist Emma Richardson Cherry, since the two had grown up together in Illinois. Dawson and Mary are pictured here at far right alongside other members of the colony. Most of them were still in their early 20s. He would always call his wife Dot because of her petite stature, but also because he represented her with a dot in his monogram above his own initials. And he would later add another dot for each of his children and a smaller one for the family dog. She and Dawson were married at the British consulate in Paris after knowing each other for only 2 weeks, and I imagine that must have required a very skillful letter to her parents back home in Chicago. Claude Monet proved to be an elusive figure to the young men over the first few years. They would see him about town and in the fields near his home, painting at various times of day, but he had absolutely no interest or time to take them on as students, and he would become furious whenever they encroached on his favorite painting spots. He was even known to call the local gendarmes and report them as spies, accusing them of sketching the railway or drawing maps of the village, since it was only shortly after the Franco-Prussian War. More than anything, Monet, I think, was probably most concerned about his 4 teenage stepdaughters, depicted here in this pastel portrait he did of them, since they were clearly intrigued by all these dashing young men from Paris. The demoiselles Hochet, as they were known, would visit the grocery stall of the Hotel Baudy every day and became flirtatiously friendly with all the members of the young colony. And here's some photos of the young men in the attic studios of the Baudy Hotel about 1890. Although in time, Monet did become accepting of them, and they were invited on occasion to dinner at his home, his fears were seemingly well-founded. One of the group, the Ohio artist Theodore Earl Butler, and the son of a wealthy industrialist, had a secret courtship with Monet's stepdaughter Suzanne in 1892, and the Dawson-Watsons would later confess to their assistance in the delicate courtship by offering their apartment for the two to meet in private. The marriage was a major event in the early years of the Giverny colony, and several of the artists commemorated the celebrations in their work, perhaps none better than Theodore Robinson in his wedding march pictured here. Being short on funds, the Dawson-Watsons' wedding gift to the couple was a 14-foot, flat-bottomed studio boat like the one Monet used to paint along the banks of the nearby river. It may have been just a little less seaworthy, though, because Dawson built it from the discarded lumber of the packing crates that arrived to fill the newlyweds' home with their new furniture. During this period, also, the idea for a small magazine called Le Courrier Innocent was born. This journal extolled their life in the colony with poetry and song and was illustrated by all the members. We believe as many as 5 editions were produced. Almost certainly, it was inspired by a similar small newsletter published in Paris at that time that they would have all greatly admired. La Revue Blanche was a graphic journal to which the best and brightest young artists and writers of the day, from Toulouse-Lautrec to Marcel Proust, contributed. Most significantly, the review was very closely associated with the Nobbies, who were the same age as the artists of Giverny and working simultaneously in Paris, but in a much more avant-garde and experimental style. The Nobbies were considered the punks of their day, and many of them fostered a bad boy reputation as absinthe drinking and opium smoking art school dropouts. But they were at the vanguard of a movement that was already moving beyond Impressionism and towards what would become the modern avant-garde of the early 20th century. I think it's been said that the French were always 10 to 15 years ahead of the rest of the world. And rather than revolting against the sentimentality of Impressionism, however, Dawson-Watson and his fellow colonists in Giverny, they hoped to transport and expand Impressionism abroad and to gain a standing as proper artists worthy of respect in more refined societies. It's worth noting, however, that Dawson and his close friend Thomas Meatyard did participate in a very important and cutting-edge exhibition with the Nobbies at the Barque de Bouteville Gallery in Paris, along with Pierre Bonnard, Paul Gauguin, and Toulouse-Lautrec. By that same year, Dawson-Watson had also developed enough of a reputation to be exhibited at the world-renowned Durand-Ruel Gallery in Paris, which represented Monet and his fellow Impressionists. And here's a photo of the world-famous art dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel himself. As more painters joined the Giverny colony, the walls of the Bodhi Hotel became filled with many small paintings given as gifts to the proprietors. And here you can faintly see a Dawson-Watson painting of haystacks in the dining room with Madame Bodhi just above her head, where she's seated with works by the other young painters. And keep that painting in mind. It wasn't unusual for the young men to barter their paintings for goods among the village shops. In fact, in early 1990, I first visited Giverny, and with my high school French, learned that certain descendants of the local baker, butcher, wine, and tobacco shop owners still possessed some of these paintings, even after 100 years. And most of them were happy to inform me that these works were of no consequence. They were at best only inferior copies of the French style. However, as both my mother and I continued to visit and gain their trust, they somehow began digging out works, such as this haystack scene, that had been hoarded away in the back of their closets, attics, and basements for more than 100 years. And it turned out they were more than happy to sell them for the offers we negotiated. Through these connections, we were able to unearth several early paintings, not only by my great-great-grandfather, but also by Theodore Wendell, Theodore Robinson, James Carroll Beckwith, Blair Bruce, Frederick Richardson, and Willard Metcalf. When it became beyond our means to continue purchasing all the works that we were being offered, we began a partnership with the Spaniman Art Gallery in New York, with whom we've been friendly for years. On one visit to Giverny, I was staying in a youth hostel in the Latin Quarter when the legendary Irish Spaniman arrived via the British Airways supersonic Concorde to join me on a specially planned buying trip. And ordinarily, I used to travel to Giverny by train because it was not only the cheapest way, but because it always gave me a feeling of connection to these young artists to make the journey from Paris into the countryside of Normandy, as they had by rail. And on this occasion, I met Ira at his hotel near the Place de la Concorde and learned that he'd hired a chauffeured Mercedes to drive us the 45 minutes upriver to Giverny. And it was a sweet ride, but our cover was definitely blown. I couldn't any longer pretend to be the poor young journalist earnestly searching for paintings by my grandfather. And because he was buying for the wealthy collector Daniel Terra, that day, anyone who had a good American painting to sell got offered sums in US dollars that they couldn't refuse. Later that evening, Ira had arranged a special dinner where I sat as the guest of Monet's great-grandson, Jean-Marie Tourgois, and his wife Claire Joyce, who was the author of the best-selling cookbook At Monet's Table. We dined on roast boar and a special Bordeaux, which had been Claude Monet's own favorite, and I asked their thoughts about what it must have been like for these young artists back in the 1890s. As we toasted to our grandfathers, Jean-Marie assured me that the arrival of these fancy strangers had been a godsend to the village. At the beginning of every month, he explained, When their allowances arrived from their sponsors and family trust funds, these young men were always flush with cash, and they'd spend it everywhere in the village until their very last sou was gone. The important Boston socialite, Lilla Cabot Perry, was an essential member of this early colonist circle. Like her friend Isabella Stewart Gardner, she had a bit of a bohemian streak, but was talented enough to hold her own among the other artists. Her husband, Thomas Perry, pictured here in an intimate portrait by her, was instrumental in building the new Boston Public Library and had overseen its adornment with the murals of John Singer Sargent and P.V. de Chaffon. Lilla also arranged for the first exhibition of Monet's works in the United States in 1892 at the exclusive St. Botolph's Club in Boston. And for those of you who may not be native Bostonians, Botolph is the patron saint that the city was named for, or Bo's Town for short. And many, many Red Sox prayers have been uttered in his name. Although they were treated as peers, the Perrys were older than the other colonists by nearly 20 years, and they fell into an almost parental role as the protectors and mentors of the group. By early 1893, as virtually all the original colonists had begun to emigrate to the United States, although some moved on to other European colonies, Lilla Perry promised them all if they were to come to America, they must stay with her in Boston, and she would find each of them a worthy teaching position. Dawson-Watson was 28 years old when he first came to the United States with his wife to stay with the Perrys until a situation could be found for them. Their home at 312 Marlborough Street in Boston had become a virtual lodging house for many of the group who arrived from France. By October of that year, Lilla was able to procure Dawson-Watson a position as the art director and instructor at the newly formed Hartford Art Society. He was also offered a position at Washington University in St. Louis and was briefly considered for a job at the School of Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. The Hartford Art Society held its classes in the Wadsworth Athenaeum, which today is still the most important art museum in Connecticut outside of the collections at Yale. During his 4 years there, Dawson-Watson managed to considerably raise the reputation and standing of the school among the other institutions of New England. Early on at Hartford, he also assembled what the renowned American art historian William Gertz has described as the first written and illustrated dissertation in America pertaining to the theories of Impressionism. In a small pamphlet he used for his student lectures at the school, he thoughtfully distilled many of the elements of this new manner of painting into a teachable approach based on the philosophies he had developed with his friends in Giverny. In one of our many conversations over the years regarding Dawson-Watson, Dr. Gertz also referred to him as the Johnny Appleseed of Impressionism in America because of how often the name Dawson-Watson appeared during his decades of research in so many different regions of the United States. This attribute of constant relocation is most likely a factor in why his career didn't gain greater notoriety until much later in life. It was in Hartford that Dawson-Watson's two children, Edward and Hilda Rosalind, were born in 1893 and 95. And in January of 1894, Dawson-Watson also participated in an important exhibition of the major Boston school artists with his fellow impressionists Frank Benson, Joseph de Camp, and Edmund Tarbell, among others. Here in Hartford, he often ventured outside the city to paint the rural scenery with the loose brushwork and heightened sense of color that would begin to define his American style. It was around this time in the early 1890s that we also see him signing his name at the bottom right of his canvases with a distinct cursive flourish, replacing his earlier block letter signature. Here in Hartford, he also befriended the American landscape painter Allen Butler Talcott, who was one of the founding members of the Old Lyme Art Colony in Connecticut, and they often went on painting excursions together. The two men whose style and compositions were notably similar, here's an example by Talcott, shared a joint exhibition at the Wadsworth Museum. And it is intriguing to think that through Talcott, Dawson-Watson may have imparted some early influence and enthusiasm upon the Old Lyme Colony, which would form 5 years later as the first regional group of American artists to adopt Impressionism. During the summer months, when he was free from the classroom, Dawson also found work at the Cheney Silk Mills north of Hartford. And drawing upon his familiarity with the designs of William Morris, he created several original textile patterns for the firm, which reportedly sold very well. About this time, he received notice of a $3,000 inheritance from his aunt and decided to return his family to Wales, resigning his position at the Hartford Art Society. While waiting for the funds to arrive, the Dawson-Watsons lived with their friends, the Meachards, in Scituate, Massachusetts, for a year. It was there, in the winter of 1897, that he had the idea to revive the Courier Innocent Journal for a 6th edition. The Meachard home had become a colony of its own, attracting young bohemian artists, writers, actors, and photographers from the Boston area. And a luminous work from this period that I've always considered the lost treasure of Dawson-Watson is this portrait of the poet Bliss Carman, who was a disciple of Walt Whitman. He always insisted on writing outdoors to be alongside his friends as they painted. We have only this photograph as a reference, and the whereabouts of this work remain unknown to us today. By early 1898, after a year what was the equivalent of couch surfing amongst their friends while painting along the shores in Scituate, Massachusetts, the Dawson-Watsons finally received the promised inheritance money and departed Boston for Wales. After several years there, they then moved on to England. And we know that these next 4 years were a bitter struggle. Although he continued to paint regularly, commissions and sales were infrequent, and little of his work from this time seems to have survived. He would have taken whatever freelance jobs he could find, such as this cigarette advertisement, just to pay the bills. One surviving oil from this period is this rather sentimental painting from Wales, it's possibly of his wife, in a garden of lilies dated 1901. Unable to gain much of a foothold in his career, Dawson-Watson took the advice of an old friend and decided to leave England for Canada. And he would spend the next 3 years in Quebec City. A series of lithographs he did here for the famed Quebec Winter Carnival depicted sled dogs and canoe portage races on the frozen St. Lawrence River. These are dramatically colorful and sold pre-mounted in attractive mission oak frames. And because I've so often found them in New England antique markets over the years, I imagine he managed to sell quite a few of them. Quebec offered him an opportunity to again speak the French language, and the communal life among his fellow artists must have been welcome after the solitary hardships of England. Not many of his paintings from these years survive today, but this study depicts a view along the St. Lawrence River. It was his artist friend Burge Harrison who told him about a new school, art school called Birdcliff that was being established in Woodstock, New York, a small village in the Catskill Mountains. The wealthy Ralph Radcliffe Whitehead and his wife, Jane Bird McCall, had lived among artists in England and Italy during the late 19th century. And they dreamed of founding a utopian society of artists and craftsmen to combine the aesthetics of William Morris with the tonalist sensibilities of James Whistler, who Ralph considered the greatest artist America had ever produced. In 1903, the school opened for its first term with 2 art instructors, Bolton Brown and Herman Dudley Murphy. And at the recommendation of Burge Harrison, Dawson Dawson-Watson was hired to teach decorative design at a generous salary of $200 a month, with a house provided for his family. During his time at the school, he produced several pieces of furniture that survive today. Likely influenced by the medieval sensibilities of the Whitehead's vision, Dawson-Watson's earliest pieces were designed in a traditionally Central European manner with folkish Art Nouveau embellishments. Soon, however, along with Murphy and the talented young artist Zulma Steele, who had studied with Arthur Wesley Dow at the Pratt School in New York, a more cohesive and unique style of furniture decoration began to emerge at the school. The new American mission style of furniture had just been introduced by Gustav Stickley and his brothers in nearby Syracuse, New York. And so local Catskill craftsmen were hired by the school to build chests in this style, and the artists embellished them with jewel-like tonalist oil paintings upon their door panels. This second smaller one was decorated by Murphy. In each of these, the rich glow of the courtesan oak serves as both the surface and the frame for the painting within, and elevates the simple cabinet to a uniquely American art form. Speaking of frames, it was here at Birdcliff that both Murphy and Dawson-Watson began constructing handmade frames for their paintings, and anyone who is fortunate enough today to own a Dawson-Watson with an original frame can trace this practice directly to his time here in the Catskills. One of his best-known works from this period, which now hangs in the Huntington Library in Pasadena, is his depiction of the flowering homeopathic herbs aster, mullein, bugloss, and bergamot. Another series of 4 panels, we believe, were intended to adorn a cabinet, but never installed. Unfortunately, both Dawson-Watson and Murphy were disenchanted with the Whiteheads' poor business management and disorganized methods, and so both of them resigned from the school after the very first season. They headed back to Boston to accept a commission from the eccentric Copper King millionaire, Thomas Lawson, to create works for his State Street office and palatial Dreamwald estate in Scituate, Massachusetts. Following their time together on this project, Murphy and Dawson-Watson joined forces again to create a frame-making workshop in Winchester, Massachusetts, choosing the Gaelic name Carrig Rohain, after the Irish village in Cork that Murphy's father had immigrated from. Their handmade frames were extremely well regarded, and they were invited to display them at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. And here's an extraordinary example that adorns a small painting by Murphy. After only a few months in business, however, they were unable to make much a profit from the venture after investing in materials and gilding supplies. And so Dawson-Watson, who was mindful of providing for his young family, accepted a sudden and generous commission from an old friend who had participated in the Courier Innocent project, the architect Ralph Adams Cram. Cram's firm had just finished building the campus of the West Point Military Academy and needed an official portrait for the opening celebrations. Taking a studio on Tremont Street in Boston, Dawson began work on the project and carved a massive frame with the West Point coat of arms at its crest. The finished painting was commemorated at the Academy and featured as the frontispiece of the July 1904 edition of Century magazine. Murphy continued to concentrate on the framing business alone, and 3 years later, as orders finally began to take off, he recruited his friends Charles Prendergast and Walford Tulin to keep up with demand. And today, these distinctively American picture frames are considered some of the most desirable and beautiful in the world. The Dawson-Watson spent the summer of 1904 along the south coast of Boston. And here they are at a midsummer pageant held there at Testudo, the Metyard estate in Scituate. And while there, they learned that the same job he had been offered at the St. Louis Museum's School of Fine Arts 11 years earlier was once again vacant. So by late August, they were headed by train to the Gateway City for yet another career opportunity. It would have seemed a far better choice this time around, though, because St. Louis had just gained national acclaim that year as the site of the 1904 International World's Fair. The schedule Dawson-Watson was able to arrange at the school allowed him a luxurious amount of time for his own work. He taught both portrait and landscape painting from 9 a.m. to noon every day, and 3 evenings a week from 7 to 10 p.m. During those early years, he socialized and painted with many of the leading American Impressionists in that region, including Edmund Werpel, Frederick Oakes Sylvester, Paul Harney, Carl Waldeck, Thomas Barnett, and the sculptors Robert Porter Bringhorst and George Julian Zolnay. Here we have some examples of his work from this decade, up until just before the outbreak of World War I. In St. Louis, Dawson-Watson also served on the board of the city's Artists Guild and the prestigious Society of Western Artists. And during these years, he also served as art director of the 1914 pageant and masque, celebrating the 150th anniversary of St. Louis, as well as the Missouri Centennial and the St. Louis Industrial Exhibition. In December 1907, he exhibited with the museum as part of a show dedicated to French Impressionism. In it were works by Mary Cassatt, Degas, Renoir, Sisley, Pissarro, and 11 canvases by Claude Monet himself. And we can only imagine that he would have been called upon to recount some of his firsthand experience with the master. We know also that Dawson-Watson was very friendly with one of the most important figures of the American arts and crafts movement, Elbert Hubbard, who had founded the Roycroft workshops near Buffalo, New York in the late 19th century. And he was also a devotee of the English designer and philosopher William Morris, who was a close family friend of the Dawson-Watsons. Although Hubbard was considered something of an eccentric and an anarchist and socialist, his series of philosophical studies called Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great were bestsellers during their day. And when Hubbard published his list of 40 immortals in the American Pantheon of the Arts, he included Dawson-Watson among that number, which would have been considered a major national honor for an emerging artist. Possibly due to his former connection to Birdcliff, we know also that Dawson-Watson spent at least one season teaching design at the Four Winds Pottery School in Syracuse, New York, with the important ceramic artist Adelaide Alsop Robineau, who's seated in the center. It's unclear exactly which year this occurred, but presumably sometime between 1905 and 1910. In these next two slides, we have also a rare opportunity to view two extant works from this period which demonstrate a technique he derived from Monet and Giverny. The practice of revisiting the same subject under different atmospheric and lighting conditions was one that Monet and the colonists returned to frequently. These two distinct works predict a grape vineyard in the Ozarks. In this portrait of my great-aunt Hilda, he experiments with an almost illustrative treatment in this depiction of sunlight through the porch trellis. In 1905, even though he was by then a resident of St. Louis, he was selected as the first president of the Boston Society of Arts and Crafts, the earliest and most influential organization of its kind in the United States. He exhibited both his paintings and carvings with the society frequently during the following decade. And here's an interior view of his Missouri studio from that period. I'll cycle through some of his other works here as we continue. In a disturbing turn of events, in early 1915, after more than a decade teaching at the School of Fine Arts, he was approached by a group of investors to become the director of a new art school in St. Louis at a greatly increased salary. And that summer, he confidently watched the construction of the new classrooms being built downtown and resigned his position at the school where he taught for 11 years. But when a promised payment failed to arrive by August, he hastily consulted with a lawyer who had drawn up his contract, only to learn the principal investor had vanished. It appeared he had been brought onto the project only to lend an air of legitimacy through his good name and reputation. Sadly, his old position at the School of Fine Arts had been filled over the summer, and no other teaching opportunities were available at such short notice. To add to this insult, in order to raise some quick cash, he organized a large exhibition of his works at the Gallery of a Friend, and the show was to contain 48 of his best paintings from the preceding 6 years, each of them fitted with one of his own hand-carved and gilded frames. He finished hanging the works at 7 p.m., the night before opening day, but by midnight the gallery had caught fire, and all his works were lost without insurance. During their time in St. Louis, the Dawson-Watsons had begun spending their summers in the town of Brandsville in the Missouri Ozarks. And the sight of the Englishman painting outdoors in his linen suit caught the fancy of the mountain folk, and when an exhibition was held at the end of the first summer, 800 visitors out of a population of 3,000 attended on the very first afternoon. Although his pictures from this period are relatively scarce, one reviewer referred to the works as depicting peach trees, packing sheds filled with busy workers, glimpses of springs and streams, storm clouds, delicate sunrises, and brilliant sunsets. Once again, always eager to organize dramatic events that would involve larger groups of participants, Dawson-Watson wrote and presented stage plays from the stories of Snow White and Ali Baba. Many of the townspeople even took part and made their own costumes. During one event, however, tragedy struck yet again, as the Dawson-Watsons' own home caught fire and artworks and most of the family's possessions were lost. These two catastrophic losses are a major reason that much of his work from the early 20th century is so relatively scarce on the market today. On a brighter note, I couldn't resist showing you this cartoon, though, from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 1910. In a much happier moment, here he is depicted among his peers as an almost larger-than-life character in an art guild gathering. That winter of 1916, after this disaster, their old friend Emma Richardson Cherry invited them to stay with her in Houston to see if he could find a teaching position there. And she believed that the city's nascent art community would welcome a man of his expertise. Since he hadn't been able to find another steady teaching position in St. Louis, the Dawson-Watsons gratefully accepted to try their luck in the Gulf City. As soon as they arrived, Mrs. Cherry escorted them all to the appropriate teas and luncheons at the various art societies and even organized an exhibition of his work at the Houston Public School Art League. When no teaching positions emerged in any of the traditional institutions, the two of them brainstormed ideas about how they might find him some appropriate form of steady work or even patronage. So together they founded and advertised the UPON, School of Arts and Crafts, run from Richardson's Fargo Street home in the artsy Montrose neighborhood. The First World War was raging, and because of hardships with rationing, the school was unable to find enough nearby lodging to attract the sort of full-time students they needed to gain notoriety. Here's a view of this historic Nichols Rice Cherry House. He would later write that the city was just too new and its arts community still in its infancy during his time there. While in Houston during the fall of 1916, Dawson did receive a commission to carve and gild a large picture frame in San Antonio and made his very first visit to this city. He later described falling deeply in love with the Spanish atmosphere, the historical missions, and the vibrant commerce, and it left a deep impression on him. After about 6 months in Houston, the Dawson-Watsons felt they had outstayed the hospitality of their dearest friend and prepared to return to St. Louis. As a final effort to find her friends a foothold in Texas, though, Mrs. Cherry used her connections to gain him a position as the director of the San Antonio Art Guild, a splinter group which had formed as a breakaway from the city's Art League run by Mrs. Ethel Drought. He held a teaching position there and rented rooms downtown during the winter months and split his time between Texas and Missouri. In 1918, he was once again drawn towards the theater and served as the director for production of the hit Broadway play Cousin Kate at the Grand Ole Opera House in San Antonio's Alamo Square. As the script was set in the English countryside, he would have no doubt been considered the city's leading authority on all matters of British authenticity. While in Houston with the Cherries, Dawson-Watson also accepted what would become the only architectural job of his life. He was approached by the young artist and socialite, Miss Lucy Maverick, while carving frames outside the house, and perhaps mistaking his chisel work for carpentry skills, she explained that one of her ranch houses had burned in the hills above Leon Springs in San Antonio, asked if he would consider rebuilding it for her. Not one to pass up a job or a challenge, that summer he and his daughter Hilda headed off to the historic Maverick Ranch outside San Antonio. And I've never seen photos of the house he designed, but this image from the Texas Historical Commission depicts another outbuilding on the property and gives you a feel for the rustic nature of the hill country. I believe the structure Dawson designed was destroyed to make room for a later highway expansion, but he described it as having had windows and doors of all sorts of odd shapes and sizes, and as a finishing touch, he even planted an English garden with a small pond in her courtyard. After arriving back to St. Louis, he was able to find part-time work for the next few years, teaching at the Springfield, Illinois Art Association and Miss White's School for Girls. But it would have been difficult and awkward for them to continue living and socializing as they had been accustomed. And so by the early 1920s, they found themselves once again back where they began, in Boston. While there, he evidently managed to renew ties with old connections in Hartford, as these photographs document several well-reviewed exhibitions of his work held at the Old Connecticut State House there in 1923. We do know that by 1911, their old friends, the Meatyards of Scituate, Mass., had moved abroad to England, and so the Dawson-Watsons began summering in Rockport, Massachusetts, north of Boston. Here's a photo of my great-aunt Hilda selling some of her paper silhouettes outside a gallery on Bearskin Neck in Rockport. This was the beginning of his long association with the important art community there. He painted amongst a group of accomplished artists who had begun to develop their own regional style. He joined the local art association and exhibited at various Cape Ann galleries with the likes of Aldo Hibbard, Anthony Timi, and Emile Gruppe. Now, always a jokester, he even dabbled in the new modern art of the day, painting this humorous gouache with the inscription, tis art, the critics say, 'tis not, 'tis rot, 'tis paint astray," and a larger oil of stylized sailboats. The local artist and gallery owner, Margaret Fitzhugh Brown, even painted this portrait of Dawson in the manner of Whistler's mother, complete with a small cactus painting upon the wall. In Boston during the early 1920s, Dot and Dawson were just beginning to enjoy their freedom again after both of their children had been married off. And since childhood, when his father illustrated the book Arabian Nights, Dawson had a strong fascination with the Middle Eastern tales of Ali Baba and had written his own adaptation for a stage play in the Ozarks. Here he is in costume for the role. When he learned from the papers that the great silent film actor Douglas Fairbanks was to star in a production of The Thief of Baghdad, he wrote to him in Hollywood and offered his artistic services. Astonishingly, he received not only a personal reply, but an open invitation to sketch on the set for the duration of filming and to be a guest in Fairbanks' own home. As filming was still some months off, they decided to combine their trip to Los Angeles with a visit first to the Grand Canyon in Arizona. And from there, they spent 3.5 months in Hollywood. When they returned east, a solo exhibition was held at the Vose Galleries in Boston, and it featured many of his works from this trip. The Grand Canyon and the Navajo people held a special appeal to Dawson-Watson, and his paintings from that region sold particularly well. And here he is during a Navajo gathering held atop the canyon, doing his best to blend in. He and Dot would return several times over the next few years on painting trips, and he created works of all dimensions, from postcard-sized oils to small and large canvases, including at least 2 massive panoramic views, one 27 by 10 feet long that was commissioned for the Frisco Railway, and a 7 by 10-foot canvas that was hung at the historic El Tovar Hotel atop the south rim of the canyon. One of these was also hung for a time at New York's Grand Central Station. During the early 20s, the couple even found time to travel to Yosemite, and he created several paintings of the park's historic wonders among the Sierras. The Dawson-Watsons were in Boston in 1926 when he received a letter from his friend Rolla Taylor alerting him to the Texas Wildflower Competitive Exhibition sponsored by Edgar B. Davis, an oil pioneer and philanthropist from Luling, Texas. The top national prize was $5,000, with a state prize of $1,000. Dawson thought his best chance might be for the lesser state prize, but it required proof of residency. Unfortunately, the year they had spent in Houston nearly 10 years earlier qualified his entry for this lower award. And since he had already become fascinated with the local opuntia, or prickly pear cactus, during his outings with the San Antonio Art Guild as early as 1920, it was immediately clear to him what his subject matter for the contest would be. So after selling a painting in Boston for $500, they headed as quickly as possible to San Antonio, where he would have a little more than a week to complete his entries. Working furiously, he completed 75 studies and sketches similar to the one here, and the 330 by 40 canvas he entered as final submissions for the wildflower competition, The Glory of the Morning, Flowers of the Field, and Spring. It was an enormous undertaking in just 10 days because he also insisted on carving handmade frames for everyone. Dawson wrote that he'd never been a prize winner, and all he expected from the competition was to make a few sales. To his enormous surprise, The Glory of the Morning won the top prize of $5,000, which was until then the largest cash bounty ever awarded in an American art competition. The notoriety and public recognition that he gained in San Antonio as a result of this win were immeasurable to his career and firmly cemented his connection to the city for the remainder of his life. In 1927, a year after it opened, Dawson-Watson had his first one-man exhibition of 60 paintings here at the Whitty Museum and was honored with 2 more solo exhibits here in 1932 and 35. By December of 1928, though, he had gained an almost mythical image in San Antonio as the dapper English gentleman. And as his celebrity grew, he was often photographed striding around town in his trademark linen suits and white cravat, with a lorgnette dangling from a silk ribbon and shaded by his adopted Stetson hat. He was frequently mentioned in the society pages of the San Antonio Light, and even good-naturedly agreed to judge the winners of the newspaper's popular Blotto art contest, which apparently involved choosing the best examples of the public's Rorschach-like ink spills. In 1929, he was also chosen, along with his friend Rolla Taylor, as one of the judges of the Miss Universe pageant held in Galveston. Because of his distinction with wild cactus paintings, he was also invited to judge winning entries at many of the San Antonio Garden Club's exhibitions. As word of his European training spread, he would often be called upon to appraise or repair antique paintings owned by wealthy Texans. In 1980, I met with the director of the Alamo Library Museum and learned that he had known Dawson-Watson as a youth. Among the stories he recalled was of an art collector from Dallas who'd sent him her Renoir and a Corot, which required cleaning due to her husband's constant cigar smoking. He boasted them to have taken them into his backyard and given them a good scrubbing with soap suds in a wash tub. Knowing his admiration for both artists, I can't believe that to be true, but it does shed light on his particular sense of humor. The Gallagher Ranch, there's a view of the road to Gallagher Ranch here, north of San Antonio, just off the Bandera Road, was one of the first dude ranches in Texas. It was also popular as a country club of sorts for certain members of San Antonio society and hosted important visitors from throughout the United States. It was here during the 1930s at the Gallagher, out in the brush along San Geronimo Creek, that so many of his cactus and other wildlife paintings were created during the last 10 years of his career. Here he is at work on his portrait of Slick Jones, one of the ranch hands who entertained guests with his cowboy songs. He was so enormously proud to be part of this museum, and when the Whitty fell on hard times during the Depression, he penned an op-ed in the city paper. And so I appeal to my brother artists to step forward and back me up, and I will start the ball rolling with a $5 subscription. There isn't an artist here who hasn't benefited directly or indirectly through the art appreciation created by this museum. When Dawson-Watson passed away just before the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, notice of his death appeared in nearly all the city papers throughout Texas and in St. Louis, and even the New York Times, which gives us some indication of the national reputation he built while alive. A generation later, Lyndon Johnson would reportedly hang a Dawson-Watson painting in his Oval Office. Just a few years before his passing, however, in 1935, he was able to mount a joint exhibition with his son Edward, my great-grandfather, at Formosa, at the studio of the important Texas sculptor Elizabeth Ney in Austin. Although we don't have photographs from that event, it reportedly featured many of the elder Dawson-Watson's landscape and cactus paintings and his son's Western-inspired illustrations of bronco busters and bandits, stylized jackrabbits and roadrunners. And I can still clearly recall my great-grandfather, a gifted artist and sign painter by trade, working on these cartoons in his backroom studio in the afternoons, back in the 1960s, after he'd finished his painting signs for the day. Here he is in his Aztec-inspired costume for which he won first prize at a San Antonio Artist Ball in the 1950s. On Saturday mornings, if I was lucky, I'd get to ride downtown with him as we stopped to see all his clients at the H-E-B grocery markets and corner liquor stores. He'd let me carry some of the rolled-up signs advertising the next week's prices for bananas, pork roast or Benson and Hedges cigarettes, and I was always proud to be his sidekick helper for the day. And today I see such a clear line of descent among his graphic works and the early arts and crafts stylings of his father, and even a touch of his grandfather John's magazine illustrations from a century before. This photo from the 1970s captures a very memorable summer afternoon with him in his studio. I wasn't born to be an artist in the way that my grandfathers were, but I've been fortunate to have my own experiences as a musician, performing before concert hall crowds, and my writing skills have enabled me to become a newspaper reporter and editor for many years. I only hope I've done justice to their memory today and enabled you some glimpse of my family's story, which is, I believe, the sort of tale that's made our country so fundamentally great and full of every possibility that can be imagined. I'd like to thank you all for joining me here today. Obviously, with time restraints, I couldn't address every moment of Dawson-Watson's career as thoroughly as I would have liked, and there are so many fascinating stories and details I've omitted which are deserving of further discussion. I would invite anyone who hasn't done so already to visit the online Dawson-Watson Catalog Raisonné project, which our family has created to provide a comprehensive chronology of his career, along with significant details and images of his surviving works. I'm sorry if I've run a little longer than expected, but if we have any remaining time, I'd be happy to take any questions, if anyone has any. And thank you again for joining me this morning. Thank you. Appreciate it.